Chapter 7, Section 4, Living Under Congressional Reconstruction. White Southerners were shocked by the return of federal troops to the South under the Reconstruction Acts. Having complied with Johnson's plan, they believed that Reconstruction was over. Black Southerners, however, were elated. For months, freedmen had been organizing to fight discrimination. "We simply ask," one group declared in a petition to Congress, "that the same laws that govern white men shall govern black men." As election boards began registering voters across the South in 1867, it seemed their pleas had been heard. The South's new voters: freedmen, scalawags, and carpetbaggers. With former Confederates barred from registering, the right to vote was limited to three groups. The largest was freedmen, who had never voted before. Most of them joined the Republican Party, which they saw as the party of Lincoln and emancipation. The next largest group consisted of white Southerners who had opposed secession. Many were poor farmers who had also never voted before. Because they viewed the Democratic Party as a party of secession, they too registered as Republicans. Southern Democrats who viewed these new Republicans as traitors to the South scorned them as scalawags or worthless scoundrels. The last group of voters was made up of Northerners, most of them former soldiers, who were attracted to the South after the war. Yankee-hating Southerners called them carpetbaggers, a term for a piece of luggage travelers often carried. They despised carpetbaggers as fortune hunters who invaded the South for profit from the misfortunes of Southerners. The newly registered voters cast their first ballots in the 1868 presidential election. The Republican candidate for president was the Union war hero Ulysses S. Grant. He supported congressional reconstruction and promised to protect the rights of freedmen in the South. His Democratic opponent, Horatio Seymour, promised to end Reconstruction and return the South to its traditional leaders, white Democrats. The election was marred by violence in several Southern states. A white Republican in Georgia wrote, "We cannot vote without all sorts of threats and intimidations. Freedmen are shot with impunity." Even so, the Republican Party swept every Southern state except for Louisiana and Georgia, where attacks on Republicans had made campaigning impossible. Nationwide, Seymour won a majority of white votes. Grant, however, won the popular vote with the help of 500,000 black voters. For Republicans, the lessons of the election was clear. Their party needed the black vote in order to remain in power. Grant's victory helped persuade Congress to pass the last of the Reconstruction Amendments. The 15th Amendment states that the rights of citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged, limited by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. "Nothing in all history," wrote abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, "equaled this wonderful, quiet, sudden transformation of 4 million of human beings from the auction block to the ballot box." New state governments began to rebuild the South. Across the South, voters chose delegates, about 1/4 of them African Americans, to state constitutional conventions. These delegates wrote constitutions that not only banned racial discrimination, but also guaranteed blacks a right to vote and to hold public office. Elections were then held to form governments. To the dismay of white Democrats, a majority of those elected were Republicans, and about 1/5 of them freedmen. The new governments quickly ratified the 14th and 15th Amendments, the last step of the Reconstruction process. By 1870, every Southern state had been readmitted to the Union. The most enduring accomplishment of these Reconstruction governments was the creation of the South's first public, tax-supported school system. At first, whites stayed away rather than mix with blacks. To attract white students, most states segregated their schools by race, even where doing so was prohibited by law. Segregation, the forced separation of races in public places, was not the rule in other areas of life. In fact, several of the Reconstruction governments outlawed segregation in transportation, places of entertainment, and other businesses. But these laws were hard to enforce. The South's economic recovery remained slow. The new state governments undertook ambitious programs to strengthen the Southern economy. They hoped economic growth would alleviate poverty and racial tensions. Unfortunately, money intended to rebuild roads and bridges and to expand railroads often fell into the hands of corrupt government officials. Although industry and trade led to the rebirth of some Southern cities, most of the South remained dependent on agriculture. The plight of Southern farmers became increasingly desperate. The South was still suffering the staggering costs of the war. During the conflict, many whites had lost all they had, their homes, farms, and businesses. Taxes and debts led some to sell their land. Even once wealthy planters were struggling. They had land but no money to hire workers to produce crops. Many planters divided their land into small plots that they rented to workers who would grow crops, a system known as tenant farming. In some cases, tenant farmers would pay a share of their crop as rent instead of cash. At first, sharecropping looked promising to both black and white landless farmers. They hoped that in time they would earn enough money to buy land for themselves. In reality, these farmers often experienced a new form of bondage: debt. Most sharecroppers had to borrow money from planters to buy the food, tools, and supplies they needed. Few ever earned enough from the sale of their crops to repay these debts. As a result, sharecropping usually led to a life of debt peonage rather than one of economic independence. Under this system, debtors were forced to work for the person they owed money to until they paid off their debts. "We make as much cotton and sugar as we did when we were slaves," noted one Texas sharecropper, "and it does as little good now as it did then."